Hello friends, welcome back to my show. This is the fifth part of the series Viral Facts, and we will build upon the foundations that we laid in the first four videos. But let me warn you, you are about to enter unknown territory. So friends, fasten your seatbelts. Now before we begin, we will have to ask ourselves one question. And in order to frame that question, first let us look at the figures which are presented by the Ministry of Health every morning. This data is for the 3rd of June at 8 o'clock in the morning Indian time. It shows the total number of active cases, discharged cases and deaths of COVID-19 in India since 15th of March 2020. If we add up all these numbers, we get the total number of people who were declared infected. And by infected, we means tested positive. I have another video which shows the fallacy of considering every positive case as an infected case, but this is not the time to discuss that. So if we now look at this number and divide it by the population of India, we find that approximately 2% people are infected. And let us see why the remaining 98% remain safe. We must also see the graphic above, which says that almost 93% have been discharged, and as of today, there is no medicine available to cure, heal, or improve the condition of a COVID-19 patient. So these 93% are actually getting better on themselves, and only 2% of the population is infected. Let us explore what implication it has to our understanding of science. We normally use the term immunity to explain why the 98% of the population never got infected. But immunity by itself has certain limitations in explaining that. And if we use the common language usage of immunity, it is used in the sense of attack and defense, invaders and victims, and winning and losing a war against viruses. That's okay if you're in the media and you are a news reader or a news anchor, but that is not dealing with the problem at its root, as we shall see shortly. There is another disease model which also needs to be adapted to our understanding of pandemics, viruses, and disease, and that term is susceptibility. If you look up the dictionary, it means likely to be influenced by a particular thing. For those of us who remember what we learned in our high school, susceptibility is a term which is used in studying magnetism. For example, wood cannot be magnetized, it is not susceptible to the magnetic field, whereas certain metals can be, and they have a higher susceptibility. The same thing can be applied to the concept of disease and viruses. So susceptibility to disease is the tendency or the risk of being infected by a disease. It is not limited or restricted to a specific virus, bacteria, or parasite. It is the general disposition of being at risk of being infected by a disease. It is not restricted to any specific bacteria or virus or parasite. We must remember that, and that's why I'm repeating it and underlining that. So if a person is susceptible to disease, that person could today be infected by the SARS-CoV-2. Tomorrow it could be the MERS or chikungunya. So if we could overcome susceptibility, then we don't need to go shopping for a virus vaccine every time there is a new kid on the block. Now let us see how viruses cause disease in the light of the new term that we introduced, susceptibility. So susceptibility or a susceptible state is one in which the virus is able to actually enter the cell. So it talks about a more generalized environment. Also, in a state of susceptibility, sufficient number of viruses will be available or allowed inside the cell. And then the final state is the permissive state. That state is one in which a virus is able to replicate itself within the cell. So these are three distinct stages, and they depend upon the susceptibility. Susceptibility is a state or a characteristic of a person. The next question that we must answer is what affects susceptibility? Because if a person has a high susceptibility, that person is more liable to fall sick, no matter what the virus is, long before the immunity kicks in. For the past 20 years or more, research has shown that susceptibility is primarily affected by stress. At one time, it was thought that genetics has a role to play. Indeed, genetics does have a role to play. But in day-to-day affairs and when it comes to falling ill, susceptibility is very much dependent upon stress, and stress is affected by one's psychological state, the neurological response to that psychological state, and the endocrine reaction which the body produces to overcome that stage of stress. And finally, all these things add up to immunity being compromised. That is the stages through which a person goes through before the immunity kicks in or fails to kick in. The cycle just described is also known as PNEI axis, or the psycho, neuro, endocrine, immunoresponse. This is a two-way street between each of these four components. And these are shown in the graphic over here. So these are not one-way arrows. Each affects the other, and all of them affect each other. Let's see what happens on this PNEI axis. We start with psychological distress, which we can call as a stressor. It can be mental, emotional, physical, and that in turn affects the endocrine system, the neural system, and the immune system. So these are the four polar points of the PNEI axis. And what they do is that in the crosstalk between each system, they produce various chemicals known as neuropeptides, hormones, and cytokine. And in turn, these produce results such as inflammation, allergies, infection, pain, or it could be problems with thyroid, adrenal glands, gonadal, that means reproductive glands. And of course, the neural system will affect or show effects in terms of depression, anxiety, fears, insomnia, and emotional distress. We are all familiar with this. It's all very well known. But we have plenty of research to show that it is the PNEI axis which actually controls infection. The immune system is a very rudimentary model and needs to be modified, and already we will see how it has been modified in terms of perspective. Current research now supports that the heart is also a PNEI organ. It is not just a muscle pump, and it actually processes and crosstalks with the PNEI axis. So much so that it does all this independent from the brain, and it maintains homeostasis, which means a complete balance over the whole body and its processes. So saying terms like a broken heart is no more poetic or metaphorical. It is actually a consequence or a result of the actions of the PNEI axis. There are in fact hundreds, if not thousands of papers based on what I have just said. Here is a recent paper dealing with corona, COVID-19 disease, and how it is closely related to the psychosocial vulnerabilities. Here's another one which is dated from 1991, when it was established that psychological stress and susceptibility are very closely related. And this paper deals with a common cold, which is the same family as the COVID-19. Here is another one from 2017, long before the COVID-19 crisis started. And this talks about the psychoneuroendocrine immunology as a psychobiological concept. So the boundaries between psychology, between cognitive therapy, between medicine therapy, they are all breaking down and they are making a complete fuzzy picture in which there is a lot of interaction between all these specialties. Here is another paper which is actually a review of how animals also are compromised immunologically under the effects of the PNEI axis, which was explained very briefly earlier. For those of you who wish to delve deeper, here is a selection of some more papers. The point I wish to make is that this knowledge has been around. For example, this paper is from 2007. There's another one from 2011, and this one is from 2019, just before the COVID-19 struck. At this point, you're entitled to ask me that if we know so much about the PNEI research, why isn't it being put into practice by all these medicine companies? Why are we chasing vaccines or some other fancy molecular biology solution? Well, as you must have realized, PNEI research shows that most of the solutions are actually quite inexpensive. They include meditation, lifestyle changes, and, as we shall see later, a medical system which is both cheap and effective, inexpensive rather. So what happens about all this research? You will recall Lieutenant Dunbar from Dances with Wolves, which we saw in Viral Facts Part 4. All that research ends up as toilet paper. There is yet another very interesting development in the medical world. It has been known, at least for the last 2 decades, that the immune system should be considered as a sixth sense of our nervous system, not just as another physiological organ system. We have different organ systems, physiological organ systems such as the digestive system, circulatory system, and the rest. The immune system is actually the sixth sense, an extension of our brain, just as our eyes, ears, nose, and touch are. The credit for this goes to the efforts of James Edwin Blaylock and other scientists. In a review that was published in the year 2005, this idea was proposed along with a lot of medical research, and it found tremendous acceptance. The beauty of this system of considering the immune system as a sixth sensory system or a sensory part of the brain is that not only does it explain disease, it also explains the placebo effect. The placebo effect is people getting better without any medication, purely through their mental emotional state. As a matter of fact, the placebo effect is a big embarrassment to the pharmaceutical company because it defies their logic. But if we consider the work of James Edwin Blaylock and others, it's very easy to understand how it all works. So friends, now you're going to ask me the question, is there any hope? Is there any medical practice that takes the PNEI concept into account? Is there any system that addresses susceptibility? Is there some form of cure that views the immune system as a sixth sense? I'm very happy and proud to tell you it is homeopathy. The art of healing of homeopathy has been around for more than 250 years. It's a complete medical science in its own. And if you watch other videos on my channel, you'll get to know more about it. The next 3 slides are references which were used to prepare this presentation. This is the second page and this is the last page. You can stop the video, take a note of these references, and if you go to these papers, you will find you'll be opening a gateway of knowledge and wisdom. So friends, that brings me to the end of this presentation. I will now summarize the main points that we covered. We talked about immunity and susceptibility. Susceptibility is a factor that is often overlooked for reasons that we have discussed. Then we talked about psychoneuroendocrine immunology, which is a complete system in itself to address not just epidemics but general health. Then we also considered the concept of immunity as a sixth sense. And finally, we also saw that perhaps the only healing art or medical system available to us today which addresses all these things like susceptibility, the PNEI axis, and taking immunity as the sixth sense is homeopathy. Thank you very much for your attention, and we shall meet once again in a video that will follow shortly. So until then, thanks.